I'm Steve Van Evera from the Political Science Department. Welcome to the second forum of the day on the anniversary of 9/11. This forum is entitled Responses to 9/11, the U.S., Europe, and the Middle East. And we're going to talk about both U.S. policy since 9/11, and we're going to talk about regional responses to U.S. policy. This forum is sponsored by the Center for International Studies over in building E38. Before I introduce the speakers, I also want to share with you an upcoming meeting sponsored by the MIT Muslim Students Association. I think we've got flyers posted on the door. Sarah, where are you? You put the posters over there? Okay, there's going to be a meeting on the 11th from 3 to 4:30 in room 2190. It's going to be basically an open seminar, a discussion, which will be moderated by a member of the MIT Muslim Students Association if you want to come and share thoughts. It's not going to be a, speaker sit down and listen thing. It's going to be a few words at the beginning and then a thought-sharing thing. And if you, just to remind you again, it's 3 to 4:30 on the 11th. In room 2190. You want to say anything else, Sarah? Have I done it?
Wonderful to see everybody there. It's going to be a great way to understand different religions and also to share your thoughts on how September 11th affected all of us. And it's love to see that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for organizing it. Today we have three speakers who are going to speak about responses to 9/11. Professor Suzanne Berger from the Political Science Department is going to talk about European and especially French reactions to American reactions to 9/11. She's a professor of comparative politics and political economy who's written extensively in both areas on French politics, on globalization, National Diversity and Global Capitalism is the name of one of her latest books. Jeremy Pressman, farthest on the left, a recent PhD from our department, now over at Harvard, is a specialist in quite a number of things, but among them the Middle East, to include the Arab-Israeli conflict. He's just written a terrific article that should appear soon on how the Mideast peace process broke down and the new conflict between Arabs and Israelis, or Palestinians and Israelis, broke out. He's also the author of a book, co-author of a book called Point of No Return, which is on the Arab-Israeli peace process since Oslo, as well as the author of other things on U.S. foreign policy. And he's written a number of articles on those subjects. And I'm going to speak third. I teach U.S. foreign policy and conflict matters here at MIT, and I'm going to talk about the U.S. Policies since 9/11, how the United States has reacted to 9/11. And I'm going to speak first. Suzanne insisted I speak first because she thinks the Americans should speak first because we think we always go first. So I'll speak first. And we'll speak, I've asked the speakers to be 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have a lot of time, I hope, for question and answer. We'll run till 7:30 or maybe even 8 o'clock, depending on how energized everybody is. But after 7:30, people who feel that they've got somewhere else they got to run to, feel free to leave and go about your business elsewhere. I always talk from an outline because it always clarifies for me what I'm going to say and leaves other people with a record, so I handed out a one-page, two-page actually, two-sided photocopy of the comments I was going to make today on the U.S. response to 9/11. And the comments I'm going to make are basically in the nature of giving the Bush administration sort of a report card on their war effort. Are they fighting this war on terror the right way? I don't think they have a choice about fighting it. I think that the al-Qaeda threat is a very serious threat. Al-Qaeda has very large ambitions. People disagree on whether they're simply aiming at transformation of the Muslim world or whether they also seek some kind of wider domination or even annihilation of the infidel West. But if you look at bin Laden's rhetoric, it's very alarming rhetoric, and it's hard to see any limit to the amount of violence that al-Qaeda wants to bring to the wider West, and especially the United States. And I think the threat they pose is very serious. It's unprecedented in the sense that before 9/11, American students of terror thought there was no overlap between terror groups that had the ambition to commit mass killing and had the skill to organize a successful mass killing project. It was like, you know, if you're really nuts enough to want to do a thing like that, you're going to be too discombobulated to get your act together and do it. And 9/11, I think, showed that that assumption was wrong. 9/11 was a very well-conducted, well-planned attack that showed great discipline, patience, extraordinary ability to motivate and discipline cadre and keep them going in the right direction over a very long period of time, be very patient, learn from past mistakes. It was a very impressive show, and something people thought that Al-Qaeda and no other terror organization could pull off. I further think Al-Qaeda has become somewhat less dangerous since 9/11 because they're on the run, but on the other hand, considerably more dangerous also because they've received a huge intelligence bonanza from the discussion of Western vulnerabilities that's been all over the press and all over the internet. I often see commentators reassuring everybody that don't worry, they already know about doing that or doing this, you know, attacking the food supply, or how, you know, vulnerable our reactors are to some kind of attack that would melt them down and make them into, you know, Chernobyl-type problems. But I don't agree with that. I think that Al-Qaeda was not fully aware of all the ways there were to wreak havoc in the West. And I think that the discussion in the Western press, and some Al-Qaeda people have been quoted saying this, they say, we've learned very interesting things about using weapons of mass destruction. It's been brought to our attention how doable it is from the Western discussion since 9/11. So I think the danger is, it's gone down in one dimension, it's gone up in another. What about Bush's war on Al-Qaeda? I give this war really quite poor grades. I think Bush is not following a good strategy in this war, and the way I would sum it up is he's waging the war on too many fronts and at the same time on too few fronts. Too many fronts meaning the decision to define this as a war on terror rather than a war on Al-Qaeda, I think, was a fundamental error. A fundamental error. And it was really unprecedented. In the past, when the United States has gone to war, it's named the opponent, it's done the usual kind of, you know, mobilize the American people to worry about an individual and talk about how bad Hitler or, you know, the Japanese government or whoever, the Kaiser were, and focused narrowly on the main problem. And I think Al-Qaeda is by far the largest threat out there compared to other threats that are captured in the net of the phrase war on terror. If you define it as a war on terror, you're capturing 80 or 90 groups under the net or the rubric of terror, since there are that many terror groups worldwide. A lot of them have never had any ambition to harm the United States, and if the United States goes after them, there's the danger that they're going to strike back or coalesce against the U.S. with others that the U.S. is already going after. So this is a very, to me, you want to keep your eyes on the prize. You've got to focus on the greatest danger. And the definition of this war as a war on terror has been very distracting and led to a loss of focus, which I think we're seeing now with Iraq. The danger posed by Iraq, I think, is trivial compared to the danger posed by Al-Qaeda. And the main scenarios whereby we are being warned we have to worry about Iraq, to me, they are trivial compared to other problems out there that are not being attended to. The most striking is the question of the transfer of nuclear weapons to terrorists. The Bush administration is saying we've got to knock off Saddam because he might transfer weapons to terrorists. At the same time, they're spending only $1 billion a year locking down the loose nuclear weapons that are swishing around the former Soviet Union. They're spending peanuts on this. And it is far more likely that Al-Qaeda or other terrorists are going to get nuclear materials from Russia than that they're going to get them from Saddam Hussein. Far more likely. And it's astonishing that the administration is just treating the situation in Russia like it's unimportant, at the same time treating the war on Iraq as if it's an emergency. I'll say a little more about the loose nukes in Russia in a moment, because I consider our policy on that the single worst failure of government in modern times. I've never seen our government or any Western government make a mistake as serious as the failure of the U.S. government to address that danger. War on too few fronts. And I'm on Roman numeral 3 now. I think of the war on Al-Qaeda as a war that should be waged on 4 fronts, if you will, 4 kinds of activities. There's offense, which means rolling up the Al-Qaeda organization and persuading all the potential countries that might give it haven to slam the door on it. Second is defense, meaning homeland defense, meaning making it harder for people who would wreak great destruction in the U.S. to come to the U.S. and wreak it. Third, I'm just calling it special teams as kind of a joke for those of you who follow football, but it means activities to see to it that terrorist groups don't have access to weapons of mass destruction, locking them away so that they aren't out there to get. And fourth is what the State Department calls public diplomacy, but which I call war of ideas, or engaging in the argument, trying to change the terms of debate in the Muslim world about the United States, answering arguments that can be answered that are being, that are fueling the terrorist movement. And I think that Bush is sort of really only waging the first of those wars. He's waging a war of offense. I'd give him only sort of a C+ in the way he's going about it. And he's really neglecting the other three wars. I think I'd give him very poor grades on Homeland Defense, extremely poor, F- on special teams, this question of locking down nuclear weapons worldwide. And I'd probably give him F- also on the public diplomacy front, where what the administration is doing is, worse than nothing. I mean, I think they've gone backwards since they started thinking about public diplomacy in the Middle East. Let me say a few words about this. The war in Afghanistan, the military side of it was conducted competently up to a point. The administration avoided the error of making a huge ground commitment and sending a massive army in there to sort of do the war themselves, which would have, I think, in the end caused a big backlash and led to, trouble. It would have been a bad approach, and the approach they used, which was to rely on the Northern Alliance, was the right approach. However, at the end of the war, there was a time when they finally had to use force themselves, and they bungled the battles of Tora Bora and the Anaconda operation. And these are the operations when the al-Qaeda elite were all bottled up in the area around Tora Bora, and they all got away because the Bush administration basically was afraid to take casualties. They didn't want to get anybody hurt, so they relied heavily on locals to fight the battle, and as a result, pretty much everyone got away. And today we still have a situation where the last count I saw had 18 or 17 of the top 25 al-Qaeda leaders still loose and at large. And that's really quite a disastrous outcome, the fact that the organization is still intact, its main cadre, its main leaders, its main engineers and others are all at large. So I don't give them an A on the war. And then the political side of the war, they've made a number of mistakes. Right now in Afghanistan, they failed to secure the country. Karzai is hanging on for his life. He was almost killed the other day. His writ doesn't run far beyond Kabul. And this is because the administration is sort of phobic about nation building. We don't do nation building, and so they didn't want to send many peacekeepers or much humanitarian aid in. And on both scores, I think there should have been much more humanitarian aid, and they should send peacekeepers throughout the country. Pakistan, Bush moved very slowly to try to ramp down the war in Kashmir and to try to cool that off. That conflict is a serious impediment to the war in al-Qaeda because it distracts the Pakistanis from controlling their northwest provinces, and they now have all their troops facing to the east. It's a major recruiting item for al-Qaeda. And again, Bush kind of treated that conflict as unrelated to the al-Qaeda war until way too late. He's also not doing much to encourage elements of the Pakistani public and the polity to feel happy about the Americans. For example, after 9/11, people were saying, hey, let's try to build a little goodwill with the Pakistanis. Let's cut the textile tariff, the textile quota. Let's allow more Pakistani textiles in. That'd be a good thing for lots of poor workers in Pakistan. They thought about it, didn't do it because the U.S. textile lobby objected. So in the end, we didn't do that kind of sweetener for them. ArabIsraeli. Jeremy's going to talk more about the Arab-Israeli conflict, but I think the Arab-Israeli conflict is inextricably entwined with the offensive against al-Qaeda. This conflict, boiling along, is an impediment to America's effort to get local regional cooperation against al-Qaeda. We've still gotten quite a lot, but this conflict in the short run does impede the willingness of local states to cooperate with us. There's been some reports that we've had some troubles with one or two countries where they've made clear that what was annoying them was our sort of one-sided embrace of Sharon. And in the long run, this conflict has to be ended because the United States cannot reach a modus vivendi with the Muslim world while this conflict's boiling along. People have to understand we live in a new age when satellite TV is bringing the conflict into homes all over the Muslim world. This was not true a decade ago. All these satellite TV organizations are new. We have to end this conflict. Bush's view seems to be to park the conflict someplace. And my view is, everyone knows how this conflict can be ended. It can be ended with American leadership, and it can only be ended with it. It could be ended if the United States would define a peace plan and use carrots and sticks to bring both parties toward that peace plan. A majority of the publics on both sides would, the polls show, accept the kind of settlement that everyone knows would be the outlines of a settlement. But Bush has shrunk from expending the political capital needed to get Washington to agree on what kind of peace plan should be offered, so he hasn't offered one. It's also a little bit of, anything but Clinton. Everyone knows that any final plan would look quite a bit like the Clinton plan, and so Bush hasn't wanted to go near that. The defense of Homeland defense. If you look at the New York Times yesterday, there was a sort of appalling article on the back of the News of the Week in Review on intelligence reform and where we stand with getting U.S. intelligence agencies ready for this conflict. A whole group of experts, quite reasonable people, were interviewed asking them, gee, what should we be doing next in the intelligence area? And what was so horrifying was how many suggestions they had, and the fact that these suggestions a year into this conflict have not been implemented. That there still is no central office that evaluates data relevant to terror. There still is no central commander of all U.S. intelligence organizations. There's still no separation between law enforcement and counterterror functions in the FBI. Our borders are still wide open. Still really wide open. Local law enforcement still has not been brought into the counterterror activity, and they're going to be the front line in this, and they're still not being trained or interfaced in other ways with the counterterror operation. Basically, Bush has treated Homeland Defense like it's too hard. Well, let's not try it. And it involves state building, big government. We don't like that. And so he's really relied on the offense half of the problem. Special teams, loose nukes. Here, as I said, is the most appalling story of all, where when historically the U.S. has neglected this problem. All three presidents since '91 have neglected it. Bush probably the worst of all, because he was going to cut the U.S. investment in locking away these weapons. But the short story is, we've been spending only $1 billion a year to shut these weapons down. And the situation right now is that 2/3 of the nuclear materials over there in Russia are still improperly secured, some of them woefully easily available for theft or sale to terrorists. The total amount of material here, at a minimum, is 250 tons of weapons-grade material, which could be used to build tens of thousands of atomic bombs. Tens of thousands of atomic bombs. And our current schedule for cleaning that mess up is the year 2018. And if that sounds late to you, it sounds late to me. Finally, public diplomacy. Bush basically isn't doing much on this at all. And in the end, this to me is the essence of the matter. This conflict between Al-Qaeda and the West is symptomatic of a debate that needs to happen, of a change in the terms of debate that needs to occur. And the administration has just not paid attention to the need to deal with that. They've got a little project called Radio Sawa, which is a radio station aimed at sort of at teens and 20-year-olds in a few friendly Arab states. And that's it. Their other major action has been to shut down the Voice of America's Arab organization, Arab language organization, which aims at sort of older folks and has lots of news and facts and so on. And if you want to have a serious debate about serious things, that's how you do it. So they've completely neglected this whole idea of engaging in an argument with those in the Mideast and elsewhere who are saying things that could be argued with. And to me, a great deal of what's being said could be argued with. Not all of it, but much of it. So anyway, bottom line here, this war, unlike World War II, called for a great deal of innovation from our government. World War II basically required that we take the existing militaries that we had and grow them 15 times and send them out to do what they were used to doing. The war on terror requires tremendous innovation. It requires that we build up functions we never had before, that we change the way we do business in fundamental ways. In other words, large government innovation. And that requires that the president show leadership, that he break heads, that you should hear some yelling and screaming in Washington. You should hear some people saying, damn it, don't tell me to change what I'm doing. I'm an encrusted bureaucrat. And please leave me alone. That's what has to happen for this war to succeed. And we're not hearing this. The president is not, he's doing things business as usual. He's not we're asking that we innovate. So there you go. Next is Suzanne Berger.
Thank you. Last year, I spent a sabbatical research year in France and was there on September 11th. And I think what I'd like to talk to you about today are European reactions, but European reactions sort of seen from this one micro situation of sitting within a French lab as people try to understand and adjust and respond to the events in the United States. At the beginning, what was most astonishing to me was a kind of enormous wave of sympathy from even those French institutions and newspapers that are not especially pro-American. Le Monde, which is something like a soft left, soft anti-American equivalent of the New York Times. Its editorial the next day read, "We are all Americans," which was something that I had never imagined that could be published in Le Monde. By the end of the week, though, "We are all Americans" was a sentiment that had been substantially watered down. 4 days after "We are all Americans" appeared as Le Monde's principal editorial, I went to a meeting of a mainstream foreign policy institute, something like the French equivalent of the French Council on Foreign Affairs. This is IFRI. And there the concluding speaker said, "We are all almost Americans." And from there, you could see that our moment of sympathy was passing rapidly, and far worse was to come. First of all, we began to hear from all those who denied that the attacks on the Trade Center and the attacks on the Pentagon were the work of Al-Qaeda, and people who insisted that it was the CIA or the Mossad that had actually done it. And while this view of who was really responsible may not have commanded as much attention in Western Europe as in the Middle East, still it was surprising how much attention this view did get. And by the time I left France at the end of June, I was astonished to read that one of the best-selling books in French bookstores was a book that claimed that no airplane ever went into the Pentagon, and this book had sold 200,000 copies in France by June. A sequel was coming out in which apparently the claim was about to be made also for the New York towers. But I think, yes, there were these flat deniers, but even more important than the flat deniers across Europe were those who came to interpret the attacks as basically an attack on globalization, and an attack on globalization and its effects. In this vein, rather soon after 9/11, in the pages of the same Le Monde, there appeared a 2-page article by Jean Baudrillard, who's a leading French intellectual and philosopher, who analyzed 9/11 as essentially an attack on globalism and on America's role as a superpower, basically identical, as a superpower whose values are essentially those whose way of life, whose institutions are those that have been imposed through globalization. Let me read you a little of what he wrote. He said, "The moral condemnation, the sacred union against terrorism are on a scale with the vast jubilation at seeing the destruction of this world superpower, or rather at seeing it in a sense self-destruct, a beautiful suicide, because this superpower, by its unbearable potency, has roused all the world's innate violence, and thus, without knowing it, it has aroused the terrorist imagination that dwells in all of us. Ultimately, it is they who've done the deed, but it is we who have wanted it. Now, there were other French who wrote back in indignation to attack Baudrillard. And if you look at French opinion polls, they were generally fairly supportive of the United States. But if Baudrillard was extreme and articulate in his expression of his views, he was far from alone in seeing the attacks as a kind of just retribution for America's role in globalization and for America's role in the world in general. And the way these points were usually made, and I had these discussions with my colleagues in the research center and others, it would usually start with an expression of sympathy about the victims. The president, for example, of ATTAC, the largest anti-globalization movement in the world, the organization, the organization that organized the World Social Forum at Porto Alegre, he and I were involved in a debate at Oxford. And he started by saying, of course he couldn't condone the killing. He couldn't condone the killing of innocent people. And of course he felt sad about it. But he thought the real point that was important was how happy people were all over the world. And moreover, although he certainly couldn't approve of killing people, why should we be focusing so much on a few thousand people in New York and Washington when every day 30,000 children die of starvation across the world? Of course, the other speakers would say they don't approve of killing people, but why is what happened in New York or in Washington any worse or any different than the terrorism that we French or we Spaniards or we Indians or we Russians have had to endure and learn to accommodate within our societies as a result of Algerian, fill in the blank, as a result of Algerian or Basque or Kashmiri or Chechen terrorism? Why make these events? Why should Americans feel that their suffering, their victims, their sorrow at the situation of their compatriots, why should that be used as the occasion to drag the world into a kind of war that we French or Spanish or Indians or Russians never would have had the opportunity to have waged on behalf of our own fellow citizens? Now, in some sense, these arguments, no matter how disturbing they were, and I did find them disturbing, that came from people who had long been anti-American and whose power and influence, even in their own societies, at least in Europe, is somewhat limited. What I found far more important were the deep misunderstandings that I could see opening between Americans and even those Europeans most disposed to see themselves as friends and allies. And I think there, with people who saw themselves ordinarily as people, as pro-Americans, as people who were prepared in general to defend alliance with the United States, and prepared in the initial reactions in Afghanistan to defend American reactions, to begin to see the gap that opened over the course of the year, after September, after December, November, December. That's what I think is really the most serious for us to focus on. Let me start with what I see as the misunderstandings on the part of the Europeans, because it's always easier to see how others misunderstand us than to really examine oneself and ask how we are misunderstanding them. On the side of the Europeans, in reading European press, I think there was and is a real misreading of the American mood. I think there's been, on the European side, a real inability to distinguish between a kind of America's sadness, a sense of loss, a sense of horror, a sense of sorrow, and on the other side, American patriotism, chauvinism, militarism, and crusading spirit. And as one little example of this, I would mention the matter of the flag. The fact that the American flag has been used to express and represent these new meanings, a sense of solidarity and sorrow, as well as to carry the traditional patriotic messages, I think has made the American mood almost incomprehensible to Europeans. When Europeans see flags displayed everywhere in the United States, on lapels, on cars, in clothing, on stores and houses and T-shirts, they see only the traditional meaning of a flag as a call to arms. They do not understand that displaying the flag has, after 9/11, been also a way of expressing a kind of solidarity in sorrow. I tried to point out to my colleagues in the Research Institute that the shape of the red, white, and blue lapel pins that people wore was exactly the same shape as the red lapel knots that people wear to express their solidarity with AIDS victims, or the pink lapel pins in exactly the same shape that people wore to express their solidarity with women with breast cancer. That the shape of the lapel pin was highly significant of the new meaning that the red, white, that red, white, and blue had acquired. I told them about my American left-wing friends who, for the first time in their lives, put flags in their windows. But my French colleagues, despite whatever goodwill for me personally, could only see in all those American flags, in the repeated memorial services at Ground Zero, in the New York Times profiles of the victims, all they can see in this is a whipping up of patriotic fervor and militarism and a zeal to bomb into submission anything and anyone who seems to fall under an American definition of terrorism. Now, of course, the Europeans' misreading of the American mood was not, we were not innocent in this matter. It was powerfully reinforced by what the Europeans heard from our president. When President Bush talks about a crusade against terror, when he talks about an axis of evil, Europeans understand that Americans are once again looking at the political world as a terrain of moral absolutes, as a terrain of clear black and white distinctions between good and evil, as a terrain on which evil has to be crushed entirely. And most worrisome to Europeans, they see Americans as believing that this is a terrain of battle in which the critical element of success is technological capabilities transformed into military weapons and military interventions. When President Bush and his top advisors make clear that on these terrains, our friends and allies are those who accept our way of fighting, our way of responding and seeing these issues, the Europeans feel ever more justified in believing that this is a battle in which their role is only of auxiliaries and not genuinely of allies. If I look for the sty in the mote in my own eye, on the American side, what have our fundamental misunderstandings been of the Europeans? I think it's been to read European reservations about American responses, and particularly about to read American reservations as we see the Europeans' reservations basically as symptomatic of their weakness or as a sign of their anti-Americanism. Now, both of these points have more than a grain of truth, but there's more than that in it. I think they have more than a grain of truth because it's a fact that all members of the European Union together spend less on defense than the United States, and that the gap between their modernization of their military capabilities and our own is a gap that's been growing. The issue is not only of the weakness of the European defense effort, but of European lack of willingness to take a lead, even in areas that are close to their own societies, even in Yugoslavia, where they were ultimately unwilling to move without U.S. participation and U.S. lead. Some American analysts, like Robert Kagan, claim that the differences between U.S. and European responses to 9/11, in fact, essentially boil down to the differences between a strong power and a weak power. Kagan says that when the United States was a young country and a weak country, we too downplayed the role of force in international affairs. That if we look at American 18th and 19th century statesmen, they sounded just the way European statesmen sound today, extolling the virtues of commerce as the balm of international strife. That we too, when we were young and weak, appealed to international law and international opinion over brute force. But today, says Kagan, the roles have been reversed. And it's the Europeans who see the world through the eyes of weaker powers. And so for someone like Kagan, what we're seeing, the differences that we're seeing really boil down to the differences between weak and strong. I think some Americans discount the Europeans' reservations, not only on the grounds that the Europeans' position might be the position of weaker powers, but they discount the Europeans' position because they see in it anti-Americanism. And it's true. Anti-Americanism is a powerful force in Europe. It is a fact that globalization and Americanization are for many one and the same thing, and that to be anti-globalization is to be anti-American, as in the passage that I read you from Baudrillard. But I think it's critical to go beyond our quick dismissal of the Europeans and a quick dismissal of their motives as either symptomatic of weakness or symptomatic of anti-Americanism. What's really important is that the Europeans who are our closest friends and allies have been upset and outraged by the trajectory of American responses. There is deep and growing anger, even among our oldest allies and friends, about what they see as our unilateralism. Last week, some of you may have read the interview with Chancellor Schroeder of Germany in the New York Times. He said, consultation among grown-up nations has to mean not just consultations about the how and the when, but also about the whether. President Chirac, in the interview today, in today's New York Times, asked, if the United States claims the right to preemptive action, why should China not claim the right for preemptive action against Taiwan? Or India, its right to preemptive action against Pakistan? If each nation claims for itself the rights to unilateral and preemptive action that the United States is defining for itself, what kind of anarchy would we see emerging in the world? As a number of our European friends point out, we may be the single hegemonic power in the world, the strongest hegemon that the world has ever known. But the fact is that stable hegemony needs to be based not only on brute force and military superiority, but on consensus and legitimacy. And our unilateralism, our behavior, our way of dealing with allies, undermines the foundations of our own claims to represent the interests of the whole planet. American unilateralism undermines our own situation as a hegemon. We can't expect that others will respect general principles for world order, whether they have to do with free trade or have to do with rule of law, if we claim the right at our own discretion to exempt ourselves from these principles. A French political scientist, Pierre Asner, has written, any imperial power has to balance its interests as a nation and its interests as a leader, which include the interests of the system it leads, that is, of its empire, and nowadays, to a certain extent, of the whole planet. Asner points out that in the post-World War II period, the United States got this point, but that today, the Bush administration is both more ambitious as an imperial power and more narrowly national than any American administration has ever been. We have only to look at our economic protectionism, our insistence on protecting our own farmers, on protecting our own steel makers, our unwillingness to accept holding Americans to account in any international tribunals, to look at examples of this willingness, insistence on exempting ourselves from the same principles that we're pushing on the rest of the world. Asner also points out that this administration has pushed to an extreme the absolute distinctions between Americans and non-Americans, between the human rights of American citizens and those of aliens, and between the values of American lives and that of Allied soldiers in the common struggle. I think one question you might ask, listening to all this, is why we should care what they think. And in fact, a French journalist who interviewed George W. Bush reports him as having said, when the French journalist laid out for him the differences between how French think and American foreign policy, that Bush's response was, "Who cares?" So you could think, well, I mean, you'd be in good company, I guess, if you too said, why should we care what they think? And I think the simple answer is we need them. It's simply not possible to achieve the kind of victory over terrorism, to deal with its global extensions without allies, without the Europeans as our allies. The networks of terrorists, to start out with, are globally distributed. And if we wish to have the Europeans' support in this effort, if we need to involve them in this, we need to involve them in this, to get their views. If we want to make America safe in the world, we need to be able to convince others to collaborate, cooperate, and consent, not simply to submit. If we want, for example, the Europeans to hand over terrorist suspects to us to interrogate in order to ensure our own security, we need to care about what Europeans think about how prisoners will be treated, and we need to think about what they think about capital punishment. Because if we don't take into consideration their views on these issues, they will not, to take this one practical issue, but this could apply to a much larger range of issues as well, they will not hand them over. So collaboration and cooperation are inevitably going to involve some measure of taking the other party's perspectives and norms into account. And if we cannot achieve this, even with those leaders and those peoples who have historically been our closest allies and friends, how could we conceivably imagine doing so with groups whose values and historical experiences are even more distant from our own? I think we need the Europeans because their ideals are fundamentally our own, and we cannot deny their claims without cutting off and mutilating a vital part of what it is, in the best sense, to be an American.
Thanks.
Jeremy Pressman.
Thank you. I hope I can add something to two very powerful presentations, and I guess if I can't, Professor Van Evera will give me an F- for my presentation tonight. I'm going to talk about the Middle East, partly about how this has all been received in the Middle East, and partly about some of the interaction between the United States and the Middle East. I want to start by just throwing out some sort of broad trend lines, ideas, arguments that are going on in the region, and then maybe move it, depending on time constraints, move into some specific areas as well. So let me start with some of these broad trend lines of what some of the reaction in the Middle East has been. And I think interesting to me is that some of this echoes some of what Professor Berger talked about in Europe. The first and easiest one is that the US had this coming, that sometimes when you're constantly in people's faces, when you're constantly exerting your political, economic, and cultural power, someone's going to bite back. And so sometimes the bully really does get its due. And it's not necessarily a happiness that this happened, but just sort of in an evaluative sense, that it's not surprising that something like this would happen to a power that puts itself in so many other people's business. And you might group people simplistically along those lines of whether they just think the United States got this in a sort of standard action-reaction kind of way, or whether they actually thought the United States deserved this. Secondly, as is often the case in dealing with issues about the United States, not just in the Middle East but elsewhere, a separation of the American people from American policy. significant good feelings towards the American people and significant sympathy towards the victims of 9/11, but major antipathy towards the United States government, antipathy towards the United States reaction to 9/11, and also linking back to the first point that not surprising given US policy. And again, Professor Berger has written and spoken a lot about the economic and cultural ways in which globalization emanating from the West interacts with other societies. And I think this is part of it, this idea of people and policy sometimes being separate. And having that kind of cognitive dissonance, that idea that you can sit in a McDonald's and rail against the American machine, et cetera, while you're in Cairo. But somehow it works itself out or coexists. Thirdly, and this certainly goes around the world, not simply in the Middle East, and we've seen it in the United States as well, but a debate among Muslims about what Islam is, what it stands for, how it should be used, if at all, what its interaction between a religion and a political agenda is or should be. And it speaks to some larger questions we often have about religion, one of which is there an essential religion, whatever religion we choose, or do religions really have multiple narratives? Are there multiple understandings of each religion? And particularly in this case, is Islam simply being used by those who have an agenda, as Qaeda does, that includes violence? Or is Islam, as some certainly in the United States would charge, part of the educational process, part of the causal process that's causing these people to commit violence? Is it just an instrument, a tool that they use because it provides some nice phrases, or is it something that's actually driving them to do this? Fourthly, concern among some of the political leaders and movements in the region, heads of state, heads of government, and also non-governmental movements, of being seen on the wrong side of the war on terrorism. And this was particularly true in the early months after 9/11. A concern that the United States was angry, it was out to do damage around the world, and certainly we saw in Afghanistan, and that it was a very risky policy to do things. And it was interesting, and hopefully I'll talk a little bit about the Israeli-Palestinian arena in a few minutes, but even Hamas put a halt to suicide bombings after 9/11, and it only resumed after a Hamas leader was assassinated by Israel in late November of 2001. And so even Hamas recognized that the perception of suicide tactics and the perception of terrorism might change how they would be received and how they could advance their agenda. Fifthly, a certain level of defensiveness in the region. And you see this in very specific ways. And the easiest example is Saudi Arabia, where 15 of the 19 hijackers involved in 9/11 came from. So you see it in very specific ways in a country like Saudi Arabia, but also in very general ways as well, because the region, in much of the international press, much of the Western press, is constantly under a barrage of charges of being backward, underdeveloped, the most underdeveloped area in the world, or next to Africa, the most underdeveloped, politically backward, violent, et cetera. And you can fill in whatever adjectives or other words you like. So it's a region that's under assault in a way rhetorically, and feels that pressure to justify positions and justify why it is what it is, why it has the political systems it does, why it has the economic problems that it does. Sixthly, and I'll just say this briefly, because the war in Iraq has grown in prominence, or the issue of a war against Iraq has grown in prominence, and is the foremost issue today in U.S. foreign policy. But a wide belief that the link between 9/11 and the war in Iraq doesn't exist, and not necessarily from looking carefully at evidence and deciding that there's no actual link between what happened on September 11th, but more that it's very clear that the United States has always wanted to get Iraq, and this is just a pretext for doing so. Seventh, despite some aspects of the way the war was conducted in Afghanistan that upset people, no love lost for the Taliban. For many of the governments in the Middle East, not all, but for many of them, the Taliban represented a very sort of extremist model of Islam, and a dangerous model that could come back and haunt them, particularly for some of the so-called secular regimes in the region, regimes like Syria and Iraq. And therefore, not a lot of love lost to see the Taliban fall. Eighth, and again, Professor Berger mentioned this in the context of Europe, but it was certainly rampant in the Middle East, the issue of hoaxes and the idea that this was all sort of just a game, that the planes, it's just digital enhancement, that the Mossad did it, et cetera. Professor Berger talked about it, but that was very widespread, and it's an easy way. We've all seen how things spread on the internet, and this spread on the internet, but it was also spread in traditional ways of media and oral traditions as well. So a lot of hoaxes, and that this never happened. And the last sort of broader thing I just want to mention, and then delve into some of the specifics, is the issue of cooperation with the United States against Al-Qaeda. And this ties into some of what I've said already, which is we tend to view this region in sort of a monolithic way, and I think here we know that that's a mistake, that there's nuance and there's differentiation. And one of the ways we've seen this is a country like Syria, right? Syria, a country that's on the United States State Department's list as a country that sponsors terrorism, is a country that has very closely cooperated with the United States in the battle against Al-Qaeda. Okay, so more nuance on this, and Egypt as well has cooperated. Egypt, it is alleged, is a country that's allowed the United States to take Al-Qaeda suspects there because then they're not subject to the same kind of protections when they're interrogated that they would be subject to if they're brought to the United States, although I'm not sure what those protections they have in Guantanamo Bay are anyway. But that there is actually some cooperation in the region, and some of this goes on very quietly for obvious reasons if we talk about some of the political dynamics. Let me shift gears a bit now and talk about some of a few specific cases in the Middle East. And I'll only say a few brief words because I'd love to move on to questions and hear your comments. First, in Saudi Arabia, I think it's pretty clear right now that there's great unease in the US-Saudi relationship. It's not necessarily unease at the top. I mean, the Bush administration, the people of Brown, Bush, like Cheney and Rumsfeld, the people who make the decisions, the people at the top of the Saudi government, Crown Prince Abdullah, the defense minister, the acting sort of head of the country, the acting prime minister, the minister of defense, Prince Sultan, and others clearly feel very strongly about the US-Saudi relationship. And at that level, there's not a lot of differences that went on after 9/11. The problem is that at both of the popular levels, at both the Saudi popular level and the American popular level, there was a lot of bad feeling and antipathy towards the other side. Some of it existed before, and some of it was exacerbated in the United States. So we have a very strong gap between, I think important to note, between the leadership and what the people believe on both sides of this relationship. Secondly, is a recognition in Saudi Arabia among some of the leadership that the idea that they had been using for how to deal with their own internal extremists is an idea that ultimately came back to bite them and put them in this kind of crunch that they're in now. And the idea was essentially that you export them, right? When Osama bin Laden's causing you trouble, you take away citizenship and you send him off to somewhere else in the world, whether that's Afghanistan or the Sudan or somewhere else. And not just Osama bin Laden. You do that in a general way with the people who are giving you trouble. Their primary target may be your regime. They may view you as a corrupt regime, the Saudi regime. But you figure if you can get them out of the country, they'll get mixed up in other things. Someone else will take them out. Maybe they'll get worried about the United States, and you won't really have to deal with them. And I think we saw in the role that bin Laden and other Saudis played and in all of this, but also in the whole linkage between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and the relationship between people moving between different countries. The last thing about Saudi Arabia, just in sort of a general way, is to think about the concern about the United States' presence there. There were certainly some Saudis, and certainly many of the Saudi people, who thought that this was going to be a temporary American military presence after the Gulf War. And today, before whatever buildup is going on now, as the possibility of a war with Iraq approaches, you're only talking about a few thousand American military personnel in Saudi Arabia. And after discomfort, after a few years, many of them have been pushed to relatively remote bases. It's not like they're in the middle of cities as much as they used to be. But still, concern in Saudi Arabia, and again, early this year in January, floating in the American press, Saudi leaking the idea that the United States would need to pull these troops out. It didn't come to that, everyone denied it, but continued unease with the American presence because it puts the leadership in a particularly difficult position. Interestingly, while in the United States we have a lot of concern about Saudi Arabia, and we could get into examples of that, most Americans do not feel that concerned about the amount of wealth that the United States generates for Saudi Arabia. Billions of dollars a year go from the United States, from the pockets of Americans into the Saudi government, and then into the pockets of Saudi people through oil purchases. And just as a side note, this is also true of Iraqi oil, that the United States has been buying Iraqi oil on the spot market. So at the same time that there's a lot of tension in the relationship, there's also a fundamental economic link that I think it's important not to forget. A couple of thoughts about Iraq, and then I just want to close talking a little bit about the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. The first thing is that I think pretty clearly there's a game of sort of chicken going on between the Arab countries, maybe as represented by the Arab League or whatever major Arab powers you want to follow, and the United States on the other hand. And the United States saying, yes, 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 we're going to do this war, or we're going to do whatever it takes to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and the Arab countries and the Arab League saying, no, 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 you're not going to do this. This is a very bad idea. In particular, for instance, the statement that just came out from the meeting of the Arab foreign ministers, declaring, quote, a total rejection of the threat of aggression on Arab nations, in particular Iraq, reaffirming that these threats to the security and safety of any Arab country are considered a threat to Arab national security. So in public, on both sides, the rhetoric is, we are going to do this from the United States and from the Arab League and some of the major Arab powers. This is the worst thing the United States could do in the region. But under the surface, a much more complex dynamic. Some Arab countries, countries like Saudi Arabia, possibly thinking, we want to see if the United States is really serious about this before we make any commitment to it. And these are sort of the million-dollar questions is there a point at which the United States could convince countries like Saudi Arabia, like Turkey, like Kuwait, like the non-Arab but Islamic country, Turkey, is there a point at which we could convince them to actually go along with this? And that's kind of this dance that's going on between the two sides right now. There is also an underlying concern in the Arab world, and I think it's a concern that many countries have as sort of small powers relative to the United States, which is it possible that we could be next? Is what the United States starts in Iraq setting up a principle, and again, this relates to some of what was said earlier, that could be used against us when it's our turn in 5 years, in 10 years, in 1 year as well. So a lot of questions, and I'll skip them for now, but I think that from the United States side, there's a lot of unanswered questions as well, and a lot of unanswered questions about how exactly the United States is going to pull off this war and how effective it would be if the United States does go after Saddam Hussein. Let me conclude by just offering a few brief thoughts about the Israeli-Palestinian arena. The very obvious Israeli reaction to 9/11 was, besides, and I'm skipping over the obvious sympathy that came not just from Israel, but from a lot of parts of the region, was that what happened on 9/11 would help Americans very clearly understand what we Israelis face. And therefore, in a policy sense, we could show that we're really all going through the same thing. On both sides. And I think that you can argue about why it is that the Bush administration has come to this belief, but I take the reading of earlier policies and also of Bush's June 24th speech of this year as very clearly giving Israel the free hand. Basically, we're in this together, and you need to do what you need to do to stop terrorism. And we in the United States understand terrorism, and you in Israel understand terrorism, and you basically have a free hand to fight it. A second issue that's, I think, starting to gain more prominence is a recognition among some of Israel's security and military officials that the idea of mega terror, which is the term that they're talking about in Israel now, that it was 9/11 was a conceptual breakthrough in a very devastating way. That the fear in Israel now is that idea of let's go for it all, let's knock down the Twin Towers is something that militants that are opposed to Israel will use and try something. And we've seen several examples of attacks that were foiled. One to blow up a major gas and oil installation in the Tel Aviv coastal area, and a second attack on two of Israel's largest towers, both of which were foiled. But the idea that this has opened a door, and now Israel too is fighting this. On the Palestinian side, as I mentioned earlier, in a broad way, clearly recognition of the danger of being seen as the same as Al-Qaeda. And if you want to see this danger sort of right around the block here, just go into your bookstore and look at Alan Dershowitz's new book that's a very popular book. And what is he on the cover? He has a cover of Osama bin Laden. It's about terrorism. He has a cover of Osama bin Laden, picture of Osama bin Laden, and he has a picture of Yasser Arafat. And so that's the fear, and that was very quickly the fear after 9/11, was that we're just going to get swept along with Al-Qaeda, and everything we're fighting for as Palestinians is going to get lost and just thrown under that rubric. And so secondly, a strong effort on the Palestinian side to try and separate two things, separate resistance to occupation from how terrorism is defined. And so that's been a constant effort on certain members, certain Palestinians. I just want to echo something that Professor Van Evera said, which is I think that the United States is fumbling a tremendous opportunity right now to get involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that in doing so it has potentially damaging conflict, very dangerous and damaging consequences. The parameters of a deal between the two sides are on the table, and I think the Arab League's support of the Saudi initiative in March really creates an important opening, and we could talk about some of the nuances of that plan, but I think it was a tremendous advance in the possibility. And and it was largely ignored by the United States. I think we have to understand that both Israelis and Palestinians, whatever their pathologies and whatever bad strategic and tactical decisions each side has made, I think are both desperate for an end to this. And I don't think I think it's a pretty obvious point. When you look at the polling in Israel, for instance, the same people who support the expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank many times are people who also simultaneously support unilateral Israeli separation. In other words, get them out of the West Bank and get us out of the West Bank at the same time. And that wasn't traditionally true. Those traditionally were separate ideas in Israel. And you see a similar kind of thing on the Palestinian side. A recent survey found that there was 73% support for suicide bombings and 80% support for broad-based movement of nonviolent resistance. Okay? But what it points to in both cases, I think, is just the desperation. Just get us out of this. Get us out of this. We're in this spiral, this cycle, and we can't get out. And so lastly, I'd say that the greatest flaw, or potential flaw in the Bush administration policy is that the belief that maybe by staying out, this will just burn, and eventually the two sides will figure something out. Because the other scenario is that it continues to escalate, it continues to spiral, that there's some sort of expulsions of Palestinians, that there's some sort of mega terror attack against Israelis, that weapons of mass destruction of some sort from a dirty bomb on up are used, and that allowing things to just burn could be instead a recipe for disaster.
Thank you. Why don't we take questions and also statements, if any of you want to make a statement, as long as it's short, and tell us who it's directed to. Right over here.
I have one for you, Professor Berger. So I want to compliment you, first of all, on your style. It's really direct and doesn't have the ideological trapping that is commonly comes with a lot of these arguments. But I have one question. So you say Al-Qaeda makes 5 main claims. We favor Israel. Our sanctions kill Iraqi babies. We support corrupt Arab regimes. Our troops have killed when President of Arab Peninsula is sacrilege, etc. Why don't we act on some of these things? Why is the ego of American diplomats more important than my security and safety from this threat as an American?
Well, my feeling is that of those 5 claims, the first one has a lot of validity. I think that U.S. blank check support for Israeli settlement activity in the West Bank since the 60s has been a terrible mistake. It's been a terrible thing that Israel has decided to settle the West Bank, and a terrible thing that the U.S. has supported it. And I find it very hard to answer complaints that the U.S. has done something complainable about on that score. On the other 4 points, though, there's an argument to be had about them. I think that American responsibility for the death of Iraqi kids is greatly exaggerated in the Muslim world. I think the U.S. has some responsibility.
But how would it hurt us to just stop it?
Well, I don't think we actually are killing any Iraqi kids today.
And you think we're killing 0 Iraqi kids?
Well, the question is, what do you make of the sort of last clear chance? If Hussein won't cooperate with the Oil for Food program, and he chooses not to. My wife who works in these things, she says what we ought to do is simply give the medicine and the food to the Iraqis for free. And just to dramatize who it is who's refusing the food and who's refusing the oil. Hussein is refusing to accept the food and the oil. He's refusing. And then he stands over the dead children and says, you're to blame for this. My wife's suggestion is, let's abandon oil for food and let's actually load up the ships, tow them up to Basra and see if he refuses them. Because from 1991 to 96, there was no oil for food going on, and the reason was very simple. Hussein said, I won't do it. I won't accept this. The complaints then about it are from 96 onward, and the question of whether the U.S. was too stringent in the controls, and perhaps we were in what we allowed in. But to me, this story here is one of enormous barbarism by Hussein toward his own people. He's the one who's decided he's not going to import these things. And
I agree with you, but what about on this side? Why can't we just drop the part of evil that we're, part of the bad?
End the sanctions. So some people say we should end the sanctions. Just end the sanctions, okay? Of course, you realize Hussein has violated the agreements he made at the end of the 91 war, and he is building weapons of mass destruction, and he does use these resources. The sanctions have slowed him down a great deal in these projects.
But they hurt us too. We have this threat.
Well, they've hurt us, in public relations, absolutely. But they have slowed him down. I think he'd probably be way farther ahead with weapons of mass destruction if these sanctions weren't in place. They have slowed him down a lot. great deal. On those other scores, I mean, what I wish we would do is engage in the argument. I mean, there's a huge argument, if you want to talk to Muslim theologians, about what is the holy region and where are the infidels allowed and not allowed to go. And is it defined to be the whole Arab Peninsula, or is it defined to be, you know, the Arab from Mecca to Medina? And, you know, good heavens, I mean, Muslims living in the Arab Peninsula for, you know, 2,000 years tolerated, you know, hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Yemen. I mean, what is this idea you can't have any non-Muslims living in the Arab Peninsula? But the most important thing is answering this argument about sort of one-sided killing of Muslims by non-Muslims. A key part of bin Laden's litany has been that the last 100 years has been a record of endless persecution and killing of Muslims around the world in a one-sided way. And sort of implying, you know, we've been persecuted everywhere. And in fact, I think this is...
Interrupt you for a second. Like, the question that I was asking specifically was, like, I understand that there have been really bad stuff on both sides.
Right.
And I think that why can't we stop our involvement to keep ourselves safe?
I mean, just stop our involvement. You mean get out of the Muslim world? You mean leave?
I mean, like, you know, end sanctions, stop supporting corrupt regimes. I'm not entirely sure what to do with Israel, but, you know.
Well, even the corrupt regimes thing, to me, I mean, there's sort of a mistruth here. The suggestion is that these regimes aren't indigenous and wouldn't be there if the United States had never existed. I think that both those regimes are very indigenous. They have deep indigenous roots. The U.S. has supported them essentially against external foes. But these regimes, you know, the Egyptian regime goes back to the officers' coup of 1952 and Nasser and so on. It's a powerful movement in Egypt. I think it would be there whether the U.S. existed or not. Same, the Saudi regime has 200-year-old roots, older than the American regime. And so... yeah. Well, listen, other questions? You ask excellent questions. Yes, over here.
I want to ask you about the relationship between domestic policy and foreign policy, both in the case of Europe and in the case of the U.S. What are the links we have to know to understand this reaction that comes about in foreign policy? What are the strong links with domestic policies in this country that make this administration do take a stand, foreign policy takes, and also domestic policies in Europe that make us maybe better understand than the positions in foreign policy?
Me? Well, I'll just say my own sense of this administration is that the foreign policy is run by Karl Rove. Okay, you hear a lot about Cheney, and you hear a lot about Rumsfeld, and you hear a lot about Wolfowitz. But Karl Rove is a very key policymaker, which is totally wrong. He shouldn't be, but he is. And Rove is the president's chief political advisor. And this goes back to what I said earlier, that Bush is averse to telling anyone in Washington or in the United States what they don't want to hear, or having any sort of showdowns, any aggregations of interest, any telling people they have to sacrifice. The main sacrifice he's called on people to make since 9/11 is to go shopping. You know, go shopping. He's been unwilling, as Suzanne was saying, to face down the textile lobby, even though that would help in U.S. relations with the Muslim world. He won't face down the libertarians and the sort of black helicopter, nut right-wing crowd on Homeland Defense. You can see him walking around, avoiding that, and the libertarians who don't want to do things that have to be done with Homeland Defense. He doesn't want to face down the Israel lobby. He doesn't want to face down the FBI and the CIA who don't want to change the way we do business. He's not willing to tell the American military that they are not going to be the queen bees in the war on terror. Instead, he's upping their budget, even though the mainline U.S. forces are the sort of last things that are really important in the war on terror. But he's still building F-22s and national missile defense. I hate to tell George Bush this, but Al-Qaeda actually is not going to send the nuclear weapons here by missile. Someone should tell them. They're not coming by missile. They've got other ways to send them that are very plausible, very real, and we have to attend to. And he's spending 8 times as much on national missile defense as he's spending on locking away the Soviet nuclear weapons. So what I see is the triumph of domestic politics in the way this terror war is being run. And I think it's leading to disaster.
Well, in the case of the Europeans, I think that foreign policy in most European countries is really the preserve of a relatively narrow group of top elite leaders. But the minute you move beyond a set of issues which are foreign policy issues in a sort of narrow sense and begin to look at issues like relations with the Muslim world, we're dealing with a set of issues that are deeply rooted in European societies, because large parts of the European population themselves have families, are second or third generation from North African ancestry. So we're dealing with societies in which large and rapidly growing parts of their own population are Muslims, and in which the issues of how you define national identity in a way inclusive enough to make people of Muslim heritage feel like real French citizens or real German citizens are issues that have absolutely not been solved. To me, it's absolutely astonishing that in France, for example, there's not a single member of the National Assembly who is of North African ancestry. So the political system's complete unwillingness to offer role models or patterns of inclusion is an issue that I think is very linked to these foreign policy issues. The second set of links between domestic politics and the foreign policy issues are, of course, on the issue of globalization. And anti-globalization has in some way been a kind of recomposition of the left, of the old supporters of communist and socialist parties, and the linkages between anti-globalization and anti-Americanism are very clear. So the growing support of the anti-globalization social movements, the growing influence of those movements on the traditional parties of the left are another way in which domestic and foreign policies are linked.
Could I just add quickly? I mean, with the United States, just two other thoughts. One is sort of, where is the Democratic Party? And I think it's very important to think about why they've been absent. I mean, a lot of what the suggestion is about electoral politics and what they thought best would play in November at a time when the economy was rather weak, and maybe we should stick to that and not shift to Iraq. But I think there's also a post-9/11 difficulty of, as the Bush administration carefully wraps a lot of these things in 9/11, to try and unpack that and say, wait a minute, what's happening against Iraq doesn't necessarily have to only be viewed through that lens, and maybe there's other reasons why it's not a good idea, I think also constrains them a bit. So that's the first issue about where they are. The other thing is, and Jason Vest recently wrote an excellent article about this in The Nation, is the ideas that sort of underpin a lot of the Bush administration's foreign policy, or at least the foreign policy of people like Rice, Rumsfeld, Cheney, and sort of neoconservatives more generally, are not ideas that just, as we know, all of a sudden emerged from nowhere. It's a good case study in how, if you have an idea or a set of ideas and you want to be ready for when you have the power to actually actualize those ideas, I think this is a good case. So the neoconservative think tanks and politicians for several years have been working on ideas of civilizational conflict, on the importance of using force to make people around the world understand that the United States is not a weakling, on the backward nature of certain parts of the world. So I think it's also important to think about, there was an agenda here, and it happens to now merge with the administration and world events, and so there's sort of a preparation that went on that allows this to kind of run forward now.
Way back there. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. First for Professor Evera, you made the point that the war is now this kind of a war on terror rather than a war on Al-Qaeda. This wasn't always the case. We all remember the first couple of weeks, the days and weeks after 9/11, President Bush saying wanted dead or alive, and making claims that we will root them out of their holes. These were very direct, and certainly the shift has occurred. Now it is very ambiguous exactly what the war is, and I was wondering if you could comment on why that's taking place. My other question was for Dr. Pressman, and I guess the panel entirely. You've made the point that perhaps the Israeli-Palestinian dispute is not in sight, that this does represent a moment that parties on both sides are ready for a settlement. Professor Evera said, it's easy, just go behind the green line. Why isn't it happening? Why is Sharon facing some of his stiffest criticism from the right in Israel, and not just from the left? And in general, why is this so problematic if the solution is so clear on both sides?
You know, I don't have a good answer for your first question, which is why did the administration define it as a war on terror, not a war on al-Qaeda? So I'm just going to confess, I can speculate a little, but my speculations are really no better than yours. So why don't you speak to your excellent second question?
I think first, let's make a distinction between the governments and the people. I don't think the Sharon government is willingly, for instance, going to go anywhere near what Barak offered the Palestinians at Camp David, or what followed in the Clinton plan in late 2000, or even at Taba in January 2001. So there is obviously an issue about the current Israeli government on that side. When I say I think that a settlement is possible between the two sides and that now is a good opportunity, what I mean is a few things. One is that the remaining gaps on negotiating issues are rather narrow. There's two important exceptions to that, but if you look across issues of land, borders, security, and Jerusalem and Palestinian refugees, there's a lot, the two sides are a lot closer together than I think we generally believe, with the two exceptions being what to do with the Temple Mount Noble Sanctuary in Jerusalem, and exactly how to fudge the Palestinian refugee issue, because the resolution is going to be a fudge, and exactly how to do that is still an issue. Your question, though, I think speaks to why I think it's so important for the United States to get involved, because it's only going to be through the pressure on the governments to recognize the sort of desperation that both of their peoples are in. They're in this sort of deadly dance between the two sides, in which more and more people are getting killed. And you look at the numbers. I mean, ironically, early in the Intifada, the top Palestinian leaders had, it seems, a debate about whether or not the continued violence would advance the Palestinian cause. And I think those Palestinian leaders who argued this will not advance our cause, I think were clearly correct. And a lot of Palestinians have paid with their lives. Similarly, on the Israeli side, the decision initially that heavy use of force would crush the Palestinian uprising was incorrect, and it's led to a deadly spiral. And when Sharon came to power, he said peace with security, and he's clearly provided Israelis neither, if you look at the numbers of dead, just as a basic barometer. So it's easy to watch two governments two leaderships get caught up in this, and I think it's going to be U.S. pressure that can crack them, I think, and push them back to the table. But I don't want to say in any way suggest it's guaranteed. I mean, it's not. We saw it in the Camp David process, Camp David II, and other negotiations in 2000, how important the littlest tactics can be and how important leadership decisions can be as well. So there are a lot of obstacles, and I don't mean to suggest that those aren't very real, but I just think that the issues on the positions are close. There's a lot of desperation on the people. Violence has not achieved either end for either side to this point, and it's an opportunity for the United States to intervene and to really reinforce those points, both at the governmental level and at the popular level.
If I could just say another word about that, I share Jeremy's optimism, and two more reasons for it. One is that the wider Arab major states in the area have flip-flopped their view toward the conflict in the last several years from being one of somewhat malicious indifference to it. They wouldn't really help push things toward peace because they said, listen, our radicals will shoot us if we do, and so forth. I'm thinking of Egypt and Saudi Arabia in particular, and Jordan too, if you want to throw them in. Now their view is completely flip-flopped. They want this conflict over, and they have been very clear and said this in private and in public. You Americans, please define for us what is the gap between what the Palestinians are offering the Israelis and what the Israelis say they need in terms of especially security. We will provide it. Just tell us what you want us to do. The reason why they are flip-flopping is a somewhat crass one, which is that they're very alarmed at the social and popular mobilization on the street caused by the televisation of the ongoing Intifada. And they're afraid that people rush in the street and say, down with the Israelis. You know, at noon the chant will change and it will be down with Mubarak and, down with the House of Saud. And because these are authoritarian regimes. And so they want this conflict over because it's mobilizing everybody. This is a huge change. Now we've got them willing to play a constructive role. And the final point, I just want to reemphasize what Jeremy's saying, which is if you ask the publics on both sides, you get a very slender majority, but it is a majority on both sides, who favor essentially the same two-state solution based on the 1967 line. So what you got here, in my view, is three terrible leaders, okay? All going in terrible directions. But the publics on both sides are not in a frame of mind that makes peace impossible. In fact, if you look at how the publics are looking at things these days, I think the materials for peace are finally there. So I agree with Jeremy. We are missing a tremendous opportunity here. And if the president would only decide to spend political capital on it, and I admit that it would cost a lot, there'd be a huge toing and froing if the U.S. got in the conflict, but I think it would pay rewards. Back there.
I don't know if everyone here saw, though, a few weeks ago there was a report that the Defense Department, in one of their secret talks, had declared that Saudi Arabia was an enemy of America. And in addition, you've seen in some quarters of the Defense Department this idea of total war, this clash of civilizations, I think was said before. What exactly how exactly do you think America will move against Saudi Arabia if they move against Saudi Arabia in the next few years? And how the Saudis will react, if they'll democratize more, or if they'll, I don't know what else, but crush whatever democratic underpinnings they see.
What do you think, Chairman?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think we're seeing a lot of democratization in Saudi Arabia, and I think that might be an understatement. It's a repressive regime, and it's one that the United States is very close to, but it's not a regime that is democratizing. It's actually that's a relationship that points up some of the contradictions when President Bush goes around in other cases, for instance, with the Palestinian Authority, and saying our relationship with you is contingent on your reform and democratization. One of the first things people point to is the Saudi regime. So just sort of putting aside the democratization issue. I assume you're talking about the presentation that took place in early July, although it wasn't reported for a month, as you correctly point out, just a few weeks ago reported before the Defense Policy Board. And the Defense Policy Board, a lot of senior muckamucks, former secretaries of defense and intelligence people, and et cetera, who give advice, and the idea that they're supposed to sort of be separate from the Pentagon and give advice to whoever the Secretary of Defense is about major strategic issues and big thinking about things like what should we do after 9/11. And so on the one hand, you could say this was just a presentation to a body that's a little bit removed from the main channels and corridors of power to the United States. But on the other hand, it's clear that there's sentiment among some in Washington, among the American people, if you look at polling data, that, hey, let's start with, 3/4 of the hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. It's a repressive government. It's not democracy. That's, something that resonates particularly with the American people. Hey, aren't they training a lot of, isn't a lot of this education they're providing, sort of this Islamic sort of fundamentalist, whatever word you use for it, education really creating some of the problems. So there is some underlying tension and a belief among a lot of the American people and some in the American government that Saudi funding and sort of education are part of the problem that leads to something like Al-Qaeda and 9/11. So in that sense, there is some material for a possible rupture. But I look at it and say the relationship between the governments, and particularly this American administration, is very strong. I mean, the oil industry commitment, which is where many of the people like Bush and Cheney come from, or at least feel a lot of allegiance to, has been very strongly tied to Saudi Arabia. And for economic reasons, that's true. And they have strategic commitments too. And so I just think I'd be very surprised, very, very surprised if the government really went in that direction. I think there's going to continue to be a lot of discomfort, and it's going to be bubbling like this for a while because of the reasons that we've discussed.
On that issue, if America can find, say, cleaner sources of fuel, right, and therefore its reliance on Saudi oil decreases, what will the Saudi regime's reaction be to America in that case, where we don't need them as much as we do now, if at all?
I don't profess to be a sort of technological prophet, but my view, my guess would be that day is quite a ways off. But let's imagine that it comes. I think they're in a very difficult position, right? Because one of the two pillars of this relationship, besides sort of just the historical, that it has been a relationship for a while, one of the two pillars is the economic relationship. But the other piece is, I guess they might try and play to the strategic side to say that, look, what do you naturally need when you want to go into Iraq? You need us. What do you need when you want to go into Afghanistan? You need us. The problem with that argument, right, is that when the United States went into Afghanistan, the Saudis were very hesitant to get involved. When the United States now is talking about going against Iraq, the Saudis have, at least thus far, said they don't want to get involved. So the other big alternative, I think, is a strategic argument, but the Saudis, with their policies, have kind of undercut that. So I think without the oil, it's a difficult sale.
Sure. Questions a bit on just general political science in terms of the nature of U.S. power. It seems to me, from reading about ancient Rome and imperial Victorian Britain, that if something like 9/11 or something similar at the time had happened, these powers would have lashed out much more strongly and would have been much less hesitant to use their power. Why is it the U.S. has, a year later, still done so little? And why is it, though, there seems to be some discussion that the U.S. is a very strong power, that it seems to be moving in such a way that I I would imagine that an ancient Roman emperor would say it's very weak.
Well, I don't know if the reaction is a weak one. Afghanistan's government has been destroyed, dismantled, and got rid of in its history, and that was the state from which this emanated. The remaining project is one of counterinsurgency and police work, not state smashing. Where is Al-Qaeda today? I mean, who do you want us to attack? Al-Qaeda is in 60 countries, some people say 70 or 80, the number of cells around the world, including here. The main leadership are found in Pakistan's northwest provinces. That's where they're all hanging out. They're there because Pakistan's government can't control this area, which is an area along the Afghan border of around 5 million people. So, you know, what's the proposal? Shall we attack Pakistan? Actually, it's been decided it's more efficient to cooperate with the Pakistanis and try to, you know, jointly try to figure out where Al-Qaeda is and run them down. So I'm not sure what, you know, more forceful means you want to undertake. I mean, Bush believes that he wants to wage a wider war. He's now proposing a war in Iraq. And I might add the question earlier about Saudi Arabia. There are folks in Washington who have a much wider, really quite breathtaking imperial vision for the Middle East. If you read the pages of the Wall Street Journal last spring, there was a series of articles about how the U.S. should impose regime change in Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, more or less for starters. In other words, kind of...
We've been talking about it for
Pardon?
a long time. There's been a lot of talk about it for a long time. It seems unusual, just reading history, that such a strong economic power would wait so long and discuss so much about attacking Iraq, such a smaller power.
Well, you're assuming that Iraq is part of, you know, the Al-Qaeda attack. And I think Iraq is a very troublesome country, and Saddam Hussein's a very nasty fellow, but I'm not persuaded that he had anything to do with 9/11, nor that he has any, you know, non-deterrable intentions to wage war on the U.S. or attack the United States. My own view is he can be dealt with by deterrence. So, you know, if he was going to attack the United States, then there'd be a very strange disjunction here. Why aren't we reacting? But that's the whole debate we're having now, which is what's the degree of threat that he poses. So to my mind, you know, you heard what I said earlier. Al-Qaeda is the danger. They're a very, very serious danger. We need to keep our eye on that ball. And I think explaining why we're not doing everything we can to get them, you heard me earlier, I was saying the government doesn't like to innovate. This war requires change in Washington. It requires that the less important organizations in Washington be given more money and more roles, and the more powerful ones, like the Air Force, Army, and Navy, have to take the back seat. And the president just isn't cracking heads here. He's not telling the big boys of Washington that they aren't the big boys in this war, and that some changes have to happen. Back there.
I wanted to follow up on your point on innovation. I agree with you. I think that this is kind of a different set of threats that the U.S. is used to handling, and we're trying to take sort of old tools to find new threats. I want to push the panel on this point of innovation, particularly along each of your areas of expertise. Mr. Van Evera, I want you to answer, what would you want President Bush to go crack heads about? What would be the message? What would be the content of the innovation? If you thought about it, and if you have some thoughts on that, I'd be interested to hear what that is. Mr. Berger, I'd be interested to hear, particularly, the thing that Al-Qaeda did that was different than any other terrorist organization is to take the models of multinational corporations and transnationalism and apply them in terrorist contexts. And that's really made them very effective. They're able to take the same concepts of globalization and international commerce and multinational corporations and apply that model to a terrorist framework. And they made them particularly effective. In your field, what do you see as being the innovations that we can draw on from a globalization perspective to combat that, whether it's to look at non-political or non-formal governmental tools, whether it's NGOs, or is there a role for corporations or multilateral institutions to play that would combat this kind of area? And Mr. Pressman, in your topic, I think, again, this concept of innovation, would it just be as easy as falling back on the ideas that have already been proposed and just a matter of implementing those ideas in the Middle East? Or are there new ways to think about this? Is there any, I mean, what is the innovation for the Middle East? Or is the solution, to Josh's point, is it as easy as just going out and doing it? Because everyone's ready now, let's pull the trigger and just get the job done.
Suzanne, why don't you speak to his question
Well,
first?
I mean, I think it's really a fascinating question because it's true that even though terrorism is a very old phenomenon, and we have seen examples of terrorists cooperating across national borders before. I mean, if you look at the Basques or the way in which the IRA in Ireland was able to draw on support from the Irish and the United States. I mean, there are lots of precedents, so it's not that it's wholly new, but I mean, the extraordinary ability of Al-Qaeda to, in fact, link people in such a variety of countries to use modern technologies as part of their links, their ability to combine both use of these technologies with the ability to motivate people. All of our previous examples, I think, in Europe of terrorist groups are groups that were able to live together under conditions that separated them, and that provided considerable insulation from other parts of the population. I'm thinking about the Red Army or the Red Brigades in Italy, or the Red Army in Germany. And one of the ways in which people's motivation was maintained, that they lived in conditions that brought them into very little contact with other people. And in that sense, Al-Qaeda is really quite remarkable in its ability to have put people out into the general population, put them in universities in Germany or communities in Florida or wherever, and have them still maintain the strength of their commitment. And it's not, I think what's remarkable is not simply the technological ability to remain in touch with the folks back home by internet. It's the ability to maintain that commitment even while living on terms of really quite great interaction with people in your host community. So what is it that we could, on the other side, what are the kind of innovations that are in some sense being called for on our part? Here I think, I mean, the point that Stephen Evera has made, that in many respects, what we're looking at is a failure of kind of ordinary police powers. That if we could imagine a greater degree of cooperation among European police forces, if we could imagine a greater degree of cooperation between European police forces and the American police force, if we could imagine even that the American immigration authorities had managed to identify and kick out those people whose immigration visas were simply not valid, those who said they were going to universities and never turned up, those people who had overstayed their visas, those people who had already been identified as terrorists or on watch lists. I mean, the simple the facts about the FBI's inability to use the sort of computers that are available to 8-year-old children in most public school systems to do searches and link things. So this doesn't sound very sexy, but I mean I feel that if we made even sort of marginal improvements in the policing capabilities, if the policing capabilities of our societies were both better linked and took better advantage of really various technologies that are now quite available to the general public, we would be able to do a whole lot better.
Just, I mean, two quick thoughts. I have trouble thinking outside the box, so I welcome, your thoughts about the kinds of innovations. I think each side in this conflict of late has come up with at least one innovation, but I wouldn't say that they're really innovative policies. They're really continuations of streams of thought that have been existing for the 100+ years that this conflict has been going on. The first on the Palestinian side is a one-state solution to the conflict, but not the one-state solution that Israelis often talk about, which is the Palestinians and the Arabs just want to push us into the ocean and take all the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, but rather a one-state solution from the Palestinian side of, okay, you're a democracy, you want the West Bank, great, annex it and make us citizens. And the basis of it is, demographically, we're going to be more than you. And so in this democracy, we're going to be able to unravel and undo the Jewish nature of the state. So let's go ahead and have a one-state solution in a democracy, because that's the best way, that's one way for Palestine. So that's an innovation, I guess, on the Palestinian side, although it's really connected to a longer stream. On the Israeli side, and I think I alluded to this earlier, it's unilateral separation. It's let's build a wall along the West Bank. We'll decide where exactly that wall goes, which part of the West Bank ends up in pre-1967 Israel, and we annex, which part ends up on the other side of the wall. And you get all different answers about what happens on the other side of the wall with the Palestinian side, but it's basically fine, they can't solve this with us, they didn't want to negotiate with us, we'll just solve it ourselves. And so that's, I think, the major innovation, which is, as you may know, wildly popular right now in Israel. It's sort of seen as that magic solution to the conflict. So those are two of the innovations, at least, that the parties have suggested.
My own innovations are somewhat hinted at in the talk I gave. I would break them down into organizational ones where I think you have to have large changes in the intelligence community, and they really aren't underway in terms of centralizing authority and differentiating police authority, law enforcement from counterterror. Second is shifting money. I think the defense budget should have been capped. It shouldn't be going up, and there should be a major reallocation of money from the old-line military services into new functions that are now very important in this war, including public diplomacy, which means, oh my God, you have to give money to the State Department, and that's a very, everyone hates them to give money. They give money to the Cooperative Threat Reduction Project, which again, who's ever heard of them? But that's the guys who get the nukes locked away in Russia. And then major innovations in foreign policy. I think we need to rethink our trade policy and stop being so mean to the poor of the third world by our restrictions on imports of textiles and agricultural products. We have a real nasty trade policy toward the poor of the world, and it's a greedy and foolish policy. And if we ever want to see the poorest states of the world ever get ahead, we have to rethink the way we do trade. That's a flavor for some of the innovations over there.
Hi, I just think that part of the reason that some of the sentiment of sympathy died away really quickly in certain parts of the world is partly due, and I think you were saying this too, to the fact that event was sort of hijacked by the people in power in this country for certain agendas that weren't necessarily respectful of the people who had these losses, like we have a very close family friend who lost someone. And so, something that hasn't been brought up is the fact that the Northern Alliance was brought back to power. They're not unknown from having power in Afghanistan, and they were also very corrupt, very brutal, gang-raping thugs. Now we have them back. We have the plans for the pipeline that Unical has been going after for many years in the region. Now that's looking very possible, like it's going to come to fruition finally. So what were the oil interests, the natural gas interests in that region, as well as in former Soviet republics that are now occupied with military presence of the U.S. The U.S. has military presence back in the Philippines after being expelled by popular unrest and asking that the troops go home. We're back in there now. So these, to me, are the sort of geopolitical shifts, and in the Middle East, as well as Venezuela. No one's brought up the coup attempt in Venezuela that happened, but I think a lot of people in the world expect that the U.S. had something to do with that. Whether we did or not, we won't know for some time. But a lot of people do fear that. I think the joke goes that the reason there's never a coup in the United States is there's no U.S. embassy to organize it out of. So that's what keeps us safe, supposedly. So all of these factors show this attempt to use, for example, 9/11, use the human rights abuses of women in Afghanistan cynically to project our power and go after the resources that our government wants to secure, and that's at the risk of the general populace in this country and of course elsewhere. That's a huge, huge concern that I have, and I just want to invite everyone. Technoculture Forum was able to get Scott Ritter to come, and he was one of the UN weapons inspectors. He's a Republican, not my usual people I hang out with personally, but he was there in Iraq and saw the destruction of a lot of weapons, and he would like to know where the evidence that there is significant weapons capability in Iraq today before such a very momentous decision decision of going to war is taken. And he'll be here on the 26th at MIT, so you should definitely look to hear his view, as well as the two people from the Oil for Food program who resigned because they felt that 90% of the food through the Oil for Food was directly administered by UN, and it was the dual use restrictions of the U.S. that led to a massive amount of the suffering of the people, as well as our continued bombing, which is still happening now, even though we have supposedly yet to invade, we're still bombing on a regular basis and using toxic things like depleted uranium that kill people as well. So there are all these factors, and I don't want to bore everyone. There's also the civil liberties threats at home. Jose Padilla, citizen brought to treated as a combatant. What does that speak to our Constitution? Non-citizens suddenly not having a right of citizens like peaceful residents that live here, they need to be innocent until proven guilty. All of these things, to me, are of grave concern, and I think there's a lot that we could do in these kinds of fronts as citizens and residents to challenge these policies and make sure they reflect the values of the people of this region of the world, which I think is a lot nicer and more respectful of human rights than perhaps the corporate leaders that have kind of run away with it.
Other questions or statements? We're in front here.
I'm struck by something that's emerged for me, and there seems to be a pretty much consensus in the panel here, that one very important thing we could do in the battle against terrorism would be to create peace in the Middle East. And we seem to be in a unique opportunity to do that, but we have no national resolve we have no resolve to do it amongst the leadership, President Bush in particular. So what do we do about that? What could bring about a change in the national will of the United States, personified by the President or the Congress, take this opportunity to bring about peace in the U.S., to do the hard bargaining, to stand up to the special interests that Bush doesn't want? Could it be, Professor Berger, could it be a European opinion and leverage on the U.S.? So your ideas, please, all three of you, on how we can turn this situation around.
Well, of course, all we are is citizens, and, we all have our votes and our voices, and, GI. What could? Well, I think Bush is going to leave this conflict on the back burner where he thinks it won't explode until it does explode. And I might add that what Jeremy was talking about earlier, the danger of mega terror in Israel, has me absolutely terrified. I'm deeply worried that this conflict's going to get completely out of control. We're going to see tremendous violence.
That's history, right? That we wait until we're forced to do something that we didn't really want to do.
And by then, maybe too late.
Huge tragedy or calamity.
Yeah, it may be too late by then. But
how do we get them to see the light?
Well, I think there's tremendous public misunderstanding about this conflict. I mean, I think it's the duty of, Pressman, you figure it out. You've got to, explain it to people. Write more articles. Get on TV. Explain that peace is possible here. I think the basic mood in Washington and in the U.S. at large is that this conflict's been going on for, a jillion years, and there's no way to get these people to make peace. And the Palestinians don't want peace. They just want to bomb people. And, what's the point of trying to make peace? We have this thing called the peace process, which has been going on since most of us were in first grade and never seems to go anywhere. So why ask Bush to go out and, spend a lot of hotel time working on it? And it's very important for, those who study the conflict to say, wait a minute, this thing is actually in much better shape than it used to be. As Jeremy was saying, the talks of the last 9 years narrowed the difference between the parties down to a few details. You sort of say these are really tough ones, the Haram al-Sharif question and the right of return question. But even there, if you talk to the sort of sensible elites on both sides, they are very close to agreement. I was just looking at track 2 negotiated documents that have been going back and forth between Palestinians and Israelis this summer, and they were down to the, fine print, really, on the right of return question, which used to be the most, what are we going to do about the right of return? The question of what happens to the 1948 refugees, it looked impossible. And I think even the terms of that one are now, pretty well understood. So I understand why the American people and the Congress and others are sort of not pushing Bush to take action, because I don't think it's widely understood. This change in the view of the wider Arab states and the fact that they're now willing to play a very constructive role isn't widely understood, and nor is the fact that the two publics are as close to each other as in fact they are. So I think we have a big public misunderstanding that people like us have to cure.
A little optimistic. I mean, I would love to believe what the two of you are saying, but I'm sort of sitting here remembering when we had the Palestinians and the Israelis in Washington shaking each other's hand. I mean, it seems to me that this agreement on the difference, except for these small differences, existed largely before the latest round of the Intifada. So how could it be that people who were shaking each other's hand at a certain point, parties that were so close in the negotiation, how could things have gotten so incredibly terrible if these parties are so close that today we are really to feel optimism that the slightest effort on our part could really push them into harm?
Jeremy could speak to that, but I think that up until 2 years ago, both sides still were living somewhat in the land of illusions. The Israeli elite still thought they could lowball the Palestinians. The peace project, the proposal that Barak came to Camp David with was really a kind of a lowball offer. He was going to offer a West Bank in which he was going to keep 9% of it. He was originally hoping to keep 15%. The state was going to be chopped in 3 pieces. Really not what you'd call a state looking like a state. For a long time, the Israelis thought they could not deal on Jerusalem. Partly the Palestinians misled them to believe this because there were discussions between Abu Mazen and Yossi Beilin in '95, where the Palestinians indicated that perhaps they would accept some arrangement that did not involve a capital in East Jerusalem, and the Israelis went off and worked on that basis and pressed on it, and they were misjudging the other side. Palestinian side, you also, I think, have had a rather dramatic abandoning of illusions in the last several years, where the elites have come closer and closer to the understanding that they've got to give up in the right of return. There isn't going to be any. This is a dream that has to be got rid of. And today you're seeing more and more Palestinian, intellectuals, elites, and political elites, saying so, which they didn't used to. Sari Nusseibeh, a year ago, gave a major speech saying, we're nuts to keep talking about right of return. We've got to cut that out. It's not going anywhere. In all these Track 2 discussions, you're seeing more and more convergence. So I think 2 years ago, there were still a lot of illusions on both sides, and those illusions are gone. What do you think?
I think I agree with that, and I would just add, as many people have said, I think the Oslo process was largely at the elite level, and that was one of its the benefits that allowed the leaders to escape some of the trappings of the popular sort of intransigent positions on both sides, and allowed them to propose more innovative and creative ideas that could move toward an agreement. But that was also a problem, because then, when, as in any sort of leader-led negotiated solution, you can get too far ahead. And then, one of the things we forget about the Camp David summit in July 2000 is that it wasn't clear that either population at that time would for sure support the concessions that particularly on the Israeli side, that Barak was willing to make at Camp David. I think Professor Van Evera is very right to point to, but it didn't stop there. The negotiations continued for several more months, and there was more progress, though not an ultimate resolution. But also the violence has had an impact on people's thinking, and I don't think we can discount that in any way. This violence has done a lot of things, but one of the things that has certainly done is reminded both peoples of what some of the alternatives are to making the concessions on those basic issues. Gosh, that's really, I do not want to divide Jerusalem if I'm an Israeli, say, for some Israelis, but that might seem a little better after what Israelis have gone through in the last 2 years. And for Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza, maybe less so for some of the diaspora Palestinians, it maybe made a lot of sense to hold out for an absolute right of return, where 3 to 4 million Palestinian refugees would have the right to return to pre-1967 Israel. But especially if you're in the West Bank and Gaza and you've been suffering under, so much over the last year and a half, 2 years, that may not sound as good today. And so I think one of the things that's been very important about the Second Intifada is reminding both sides, yeah, there are multiple tracks. We have multiple options here, but one of them is very unappealing, and maybe we forgot that. Maybe that's part of what brings people back. Maybe there was a sense of well, the violence can burn for a while, and maybe it can benefit us, and I think that's clear that it's not going to.
So far, none of you give me any hope that something's really going to happen.
Well, I want to add to that. I'm glad.
Well, let me ask about specifically. Hasn't Putin offered to get into this? Join with the U.S.?
A lot of people, you know, for instance, I mean, you or someone else mentioned the issue of what if the Europeans, for instance, but the Europeans already, you know, regularly disagree, and for years have regularly disagreed with the United States about who's right and who's wrong in this conflict. And at the end of the day, there's only, I think there's only one country that can really, at least today, can really put the pressure on the parties to come back to the table, to talk straight to their people. And I agree with what Steve said, that there's been more straight talking lately. For instance, Abu Mazen, who's was considered one of the two people most likely to succeed Arafat. Now the circle is widely. Recently was in one of the refugee camps, not inside the West Bank or Gaza, but elsewhere. It might have been Syria, I think. And he was talking relatively straight with them about the right of the return, which is the part that wasn't necessarily straight was we're still going to fight for the right of return. But the part that was straight was you're not going to like it. You're going to go to Israel, they're not going to want you, there's not going to be a job for you, someone else lives in your house, you're not going to get it back, there's nothing we can do about that. And that kind of talk is a shift. That kind of talk is a shift. In terms of, you know, is the United States going to act? On that score, while I think I'm optimistic that United States action could have a positive effect, I'm pessimistic that there's going to be a United States action. This administration, whether it's in reaction to the Clinton administration or whether it's just their assessment of the geopolitical issues or whatever you want, is not that interested in getting deeply involved. And we've seen that time and time again. There's things that could shake them out of that. A different U.S. president could shake them out of that. Some kind of explosion in the region could shake them out of that. But I don't think short of that. I think the answer to your question is, no, there's not really an answer. It's a pessimistic answer that there's not something that's going to force this administration to be more active. And every time they've thrown something on the table, at least so far, in many directions, it's fallen apart, right? Where's the international conference that President Bush talked about? Why was the Bush administration meeting with Saeb Erekat, a close advisor of Arafat, when they weren't dealing with Arafat anymore? I mean, they throw things out and they fall back, so.
Very pessimistic in you.
Suzanne's reminding me that it's almost 8 o'clock and we promised to end by 8. Why don't we just take these two questions and leave them without answering, just to hear what you folks were going to ask, so that we can... Pardon?
Or state.
Or state, yes.
Concerning Iraq, how genuine are Middle Eastern leaders when they publicly object to the U.S.-led regime change? Are they content with the government in Baghdad as is, or do they just not want to align themselves with the U.S. until there's military power of the U.S. in the region?
It's a great question. You can probably corral Jeremy later. He'll brief you.
On your comment about the fact that lifting American support for Egyptian government and Saudi government won't affect their government, that's true on the government part because they are relying on police and their army to survive. But on the other hand, because of the long history of colonialism, people strongly believe that the governments are supported by foreign governments, and that's why they are surviving. So once people see that there is no external support, they become more aggressive in pursuing their rights. And the example was Iran in 1979 when, because of the President Carter was campaigning for human rights, and people thought that because of this campaign that there won't be any U.S. support, so they became more bold in turning over the government.
Thank you. Okay, that's it. Thank you all.